My father stood beside my hospital bed, looking down at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. There was no concern in his eyes, no trace of the father who had once held my hand when I was scared. Instead, there was only cold disappointment. "Don't ever come back," he said quietly, his voice flat and final. "We're done." Behind him, my stepmother, Chloe, stood with a faint, satisfied smile as she adjusted her designer sunglasses. She had finally gotten exactly what she wanted. They turned around and walked out, leaving a 14-year-old girl completely alone in a cold hospital room with an empty wallet, no place to go, and a heart that felt completely shattered. Everyone who heard the story would have assumed that was the end of my life as I knew it. They would have expected me to become another forgotten statistic, another teenager left without a family. But just 2 hours later, the hospital called my father back. When the head nurse entered my room to check my condition, she suddenly stopped. Her clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the floor while her face went pale. She stared at the man sitting quietly beside my bed as though she had just seen a ghost. "You," she whispered, struggling to find the words. "It can't be you. My name is Maya, and today I'm 27 years old. I have a peaceful life, financial stability, and a career I'm proud of. But 13 years ago, I was a frightened 14-year-old girl watching her entire world collapse around her. Everything changed on one of the darkest days of my childhood, inside the harsh fluorescent lights of an emergency room. My mother had died when I was very young, leaving only my father and me. 4 years, it felt like we were a team. We depended on each other, and even though life wasn't always easy, I believed my dad would always be there when I needed him. That changed when he married Chloe. To my father, Chloe was warm, charming, and thoughtful. But whenever he wasn't looking, her expression toward me would change completely. She made it clear that she considered me a reminder of my father's previous life, something standing between her and the family she wanted to build. For 2 years, she worked quietly to create distance between us. She whispered things about me when my father wasn't around, exaggerated small disagreements, and found ways to make innocent situations look suspicious. Little by little, the trust between my father and me began to. The final breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Chloe deliberately staged the disappearance of a valuable family heirloom, a diamond necklace that had belonged to my mother. She secretly placed it inside my school backpack, then called my father home from work while pretending to be devastated. When he arrived, she dramatically discovered the necklace in my bag right in front of him. I barely had time to understand what was happening before my father started shouting. I tried to explain that I had never touched the necklace, but he wouldn't listen. The argument became so overwhelming that I suffered a severe panic attack. I struggled to breathe, became dizzy, and eventually lost consciousness. My father rushed me to the hospital, but by then his anger had completely replaced his concern. I lay exhausted in the hospital bed, barely able to process what had happened, when he looked down at me with a level of disappointment that broke something inside me. "Don't ever come back," he said coldly. "We're done." The heavy wooden door closed behind them, and the sound seemed to echo through the room. My father, the person I had always believed would protect me, had just walked away from me because he trusted the woman who had spent years trying to push me out of his life. I stared at the closed door as tears filled my eyes. They soaked into the hospital pillow as I curled up beneath the thin blanket, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was 14 years old, completely alone, and suddenly without a home. I had no money, no family member I could call, and no idea where I would go when the hospital discharged me. A few minutes later, a young nurse quietly entered the room. Her expression softened when she saw me. She pulled a chair beside the bed and gently asked if she could use my phone to help me find someone I trusted. The nurse tried to gather information about my aunts, uncles, or any distant relatives who might be willing to take me in. But as she made one call after another, the silence on the other end told me everything. Every number either went straight to voicemail or had already been disconnected. My father and Chloe had clearly planned for this. They had made sure the hospital couldn't reach anyone who might interfere, creating a digital wall around the life they wanted while leaving me completely stranded on the other side. The hopelessness settled over me like a heavy weight, making it difficult to breathe. Then the door slowly opened again. I expected to see another doctor, or perhaps a social worker, but instead, an elderly man stepped into the room. He was tall and dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit. There was something about the way he carried himself that immediately made the small hospital room feel different. His silver hair was neatly combed, and the deep lines across his face suggested a man who had lived through decades of difficult decisions and serious responsibilities. He paused near the doorway and glanced around the sterile room before his eyes finally settled on me. Please forgive me, the man said, his voice surprisingly deep but gentle. I seemed to have come to the wrong room. I was actually looking for the administrator's office. He started to step back into the hallway, but then he noticed my face. His eyes lingered on the tears still running down my cheeks and the helplessness I couldn't hide. He stopped. After a moment, he turned around and slowly approached my bed. The polite confusion in his expression had disappeared, replaced by genuine concern. "Young lady," he said softly as he pulled a plastic chair toward the side of my bed. "You look as though the whole world has suddenly become too heavy for you to carry. Would you mind if I stayed here for a little while?" Under normal circumstances, I probably would have refused. I had always been a quiet child, the kind of person who kept problems hidden because I didn't want to make things worse. But the previous 2 hours had completely drained me. I had no strength left to pretend that I was fine. When I looked into his calm, attentive eyes, something inside me finally broke. The tears came harder, and the words began pouring out before I could stop them. I told him about my mother's death, about how close my father and I had once been, and about the way Chloe had slowly changed everything. I told him about the diamond necklace, how it had been placed inside my backpack, and how my father had believed the accusation without giving me a chance to explain. Most of all, I told him about the look on my father's face when he told me never to come home again. The old man listened without interrupting. He didn't ask questions or try to correct my story. He simply sat there, his hands resting over the top of his cane, while his jaw gradually tightened with every new detail. When I finally ran out of words, he remained silent for several seconds. Then he reached over and gently placed his hand over mine. His hand was warm and steady, and somehow that simple gesture made me feel safer than I had felt since my father walked out. "Take a slow breath, child," he said quietly. There was something different in his eyes now. A controlled anger had replaced the kindness, but it wasn't anger directed toward me. It was anger on my behalf. "You're not alone anymore, I promise you that." Before I could ask who he was or why he cared so much, the heavy hospital door opened again. The head nurse entered carrying a fresh medical chart. She had spent most of the past hour dealing with my situation like it was another difficult administrative problem. She looked prepared to tell me that social services had been contacted and that arrangements would have to be made for me. But then she looked past my bed and saw the elderly man sitting beside me. She froze. The color drained from her face so quickly that she looked almost as pale as the hospital sheets. The chart slipped from her hands and crashed onto the linoleum floor, sending papers sliding in different directions. Her hands began to shake as she stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You," she whispered, barely able to speak. "Mr. Sterling? It can't be you. What are you doing in this wing?" The old man didn't immediately respond. He kept his attention on me, his thumb gently moving across the back of my hand in a reassuring gesture. Then, without turning toward the nurse, he finally spoke. "I'm making a new acquaintance, Nurse Eleanor," he said. His voice had suddenly become colder and far more authoritative. "And I'm learning exactly how vulnerable patients are being treated inside my hospital." That was the moment I learned that the stranger who had walked into my room by accident was not just an elderly businessman or a concerned visitor. His name was Arthur Sterling, and he owned the hospital. He wasn't simply a visitor who happened to walk into the wrong room. Arthur Sterling was a private billionaire philanthropist whose influence extended throughout the region. He had major investments in the medical network, several of the town's largest industries, and, as I would soon discover, enormous financial leverage over my father's company. At that moment, I had no idea just how much power the quiet man sitting beside me actually possessed. Arthur slowly rose from the visitor's chair, and the atmosphere in the room changed immediately. The head nurse remained near the doorway, visibly shaken by his presence. Arthur looked directly at her with a calm but commanding expression that left no room for debate. "Nurse Eleanor," he said evenly, "contact the hospital administration immediately. Have the chief of staff paged and instruct security to make sure we have a clear path. Then call this young woman's father and tell him to return to the hospital." The nurse swallowed nervously before answering. "Yes, sir, but they blocked the hospital's number. We've already tried several times since he left." A faint, cold smile appeared on Arthur's face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the expression of someone who had already considered every possible obstacle. "Use my private line," he said. "If they still refuse to answer, have the legal department contact his business office directly. Tell him that if he isn't standing in this room within 45 minutes, his commercial credit facility will be reviewed and potentially frozen by tomorrow morning. and notify the appropriate authorities that a 14-year-old child has been abandoned. Within minutes, the hospital administration was operating at full speed. Calls were made, executives were contacted, and security was instructed to prepare for the family's arrival. My father's phone, which had ignored every attempt to reach him, suddenly rang with an urgency he couldn't dismiss. He answered expecting another social worker, but instead received a call from the hospital's executive office. The message was clear. He needed to return immediately. Chloe, who was sitting beside him in their expensive SUV, insisted that the hospital was simply trying to pressure them into taking me back. She told him they were bluffing and that nothing serious would happen. But the administrator's tone was so serious that even my father began to understand the situation was far more complicated than he had expected. Worried about the effect a legal dispute could have on his reputation in business, he reluctantly turned the vehicle around. They returned to the hospital angry and frustrated, completely unaware of who was waiting for them inside my room. The door opened abruptly, and my father marched inside with his face red from anger. Chloe followed close behind, her heels striking sharply against the hospital floor. Neither of them seemed interested in looking at me. My father immediately demanded an explanation. "What is the meaning of this?" he snapped, looking around the room. "We were told we had no choice but to come back or risk legal consequences. I've already made our position clear to the staff. Maya is no longer our responsibility." Chloe folded her arms and quickly joined in. "Exactly. We can't keep dealing with this situation. She's dishonest, and she's already caused enough problems in our home. We don't feel safe having her around anymore. The hospital should arrange whatever state services are necessary so we can sign the paperwork and finally put this behind us." For several seconds, neither of them noticed the man sitting quietly in the darker corner of the room. Arthur had been listening without saying a word. He slowly lifted his cane, placed it against the wall, and stood. Then he stepped forward into the bright fluorescent light. The instant my father saw his face, every word disappeared. The anchor vanished from his expression, replaced by shock. His mouth opened slightly, and the color drained from his face. He took an uncertain step backward. "Mr. Sterling," my father finally managed to say. "Arthur Sterling." Arthur looked at him with an expression so calm that it was more intimidating than anger could ever have been. "So you do recognize me," Arthur said quietly. "The man whose organization financed your company's recent expansion and whose firm holds the lease on your corporate headquarters." My father said nothing. Arthur's eyes remained fixed on him. "I've just been listening to your explanation of family responsibility," he continued, his voice controlled and cold. "And I have to admit, I find your definition of responsibility rather disturbing." Chloe stepped forward, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Her voice became defensive as she addressed him. "Mr. Sterling, you don't understand the whole story. This girl is. She's a thief," Chloe insisted. "She stole a priceless family heirloom from our home. We had no choice but to protect ourselves." Arthur didn't even blink. He calmly reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek tablet, and placed it on the bedside table before sliding it toward my father. "Actually, I understand the situation very well," Arthur said. "While you were driving back here, my security team obtained the transaction records and security footage from the downtown jewelry exchange. And according to those records, Maya didn't steal the necklace at all." He turned the tablet toward my father. "The necklace was sold 3 days ago. By you, Chloe. You sold the necklace that belonged to Maya's mother to cover a substantial personal debt." My father stared at the screen. His hands began to shake as several clear photographs appeared, showing Chloe inside the jewelry exchange, handing over my mother's necklace and receiving cash in return. For several seconds, he simply stared at the evidence. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. The accusation he had thrown at me, the anger, and the decision to abandon his own daughter had all been based on a lie. He slowly turned toward Chloe, but before he could say anything, Arthur stepped forward. "You have 2 choices," Arthur said. The room became completely silent. "Your first choice is that I contact the police and provide them with everything my investigators have collected. You can explain the sale of the necklace, the financial records, and the circumstances surrounding Maya's abandonment. I will also notify the relevant authorities and have my legal team review your company's financial arrangements." Chloe's confidence disappeared. "Your second choice," Arthur continued, "is that you sign these documents right now." He gave a small signal with his hand. A hospital attorney entered the room, carrying a folder filled with legal paperwork. "You will voluntarily surrender custody and parental authority over Maya to an approved guardian arrangement supported by my foundation. You will have no further involvement in her life." You will not attempt to contact her, interfere with her education, or use her name for financial or personal reasons. From this moment forward, you walk away." My father looked at the documents, then at Chloe, and finally at me. For the first time that day, I saw uncertainty in his eye. He knew he had lost. After several long seconds, he accepted the pen from the attorney. His fingers trembled as he signed the paperwork that permanently ended his legal responsibility for me. Chloe signed immediately afterward, barely looking at the documents. When they finally walked out of the room, the heavy door closed behind them. But this time, the silence they left behind didn't feel frightening. It felt peaceful. For the first time in years, they were no longer controlling what happened to me. Arthur turned toward me, and the stern expression he had worn while confronting my father disappeared completely. He gave me a gentle smile. "Your new life begins today, Maya," he said. And he kept his promise. Through his foundation, Arthur became my mentor and one of the most important people in my life. He made sure I had a safe home, access to a strong education, and the emotional support I had been missing for years. He never treated me like a charity case. Instead, he encouraged me to become independent and taught me that strength doesn't come from pretending you were never hurt. He also taught me something I would carry for the rest of my life. Family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes family is made up of the people who choose to stand beside you when you have nothing left. 13 years have passed since that hospital room. I'm 27 now. I graduated at the top of my class, built a career of my own, and eventually became the director of the very foundation that helped change my life. Today, I spend my time helping young people who have experienced difficult family situations find stability, education, and a chance to build a future for themselves. As for my biological father and Chloe, their lives went in a completely different direction. Without Arthur's financial support and business connections, my father's company eventually collapsed. Within a year, the business was gone. Chloe disappeared from his life soon after the money and lifestyle she cared about were no longer there. The last information I ever heard was that my father was working a modest job and living alone in a small apartment, facing the consequences of the decisions he had made that Tuesday afternoon. But by then, I had stopped caring about what happened to them. My life was no longer about revenge. It was about rebuilding. It was about taking everything that had once been used to break me and turning it into something meaningful. I couldn't change what happened when I was 14, but I could choose what happened next. And today, I'm grateful that I did. Now I want to hear from you. If you had been 14 years old and found yourself in the same situation, what would you have done? Would you have accepted Arthur's help and started over, or would you have tried one more time to repair the relationship with your family? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end.